Welcome back to the Saturday Scholars College Football Podcast channel. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you for listening. That is Xan. I am Shoob. And today we are here to do Pac-12 win totals. Very excited for it. Last year we did very well with the Pac-12. Our good friend ZKS, otherwise known as Gonzo, he will be joining us on the pod from here on out. He is a member of the Saturday Scholars College Football podcast, but today he will not be joining us, but we will still throw his picks in. So Xan, without further ado, this is a conference. There's a lot of hype going into this year, a lot of teams at the top that we think have a chance to maybe contend for the college football playoff. And we killed it last year with win totals in the Pac-12. So let's see if we can do it again. Are you ready?
Absolutely. We were the Pac-12 Whisperers last year. I don't see why we can't be the Pac-12 Whisperers again this year. Hey, it's pretty obvious that we think pretty highly at the top of the league this year, especially when you looked at YouTube. We dropped a video on that just last week just to show how we feel about this league as a whole. But let's go ahead and jump into it.
All right, cue the music.
When I looked at this being 8.5, I said to myself, no way, no how, that is an easy under. But then I opened my handy dandy notebook and I did a little bit of research. I did a little bit digging.
The Texas Longhorns, a team that perennially underachieves. Are you telling me they are going to go 10-2 or are they going to go 8-4?
Get the dang police out there, because it's going to be animal cruelty what they're going to put this Buffalo through this season. Thank God that certain things are legal in Colorado, because you're going to need a lot of that to watch this team.
Let's go. Pac-12 win totals. Starting at the top, USC with a line of 10 wins. Xan, let's lead us off.
Yeah, Shoob, but USC, no shortage of movement this offseason in the transfer portal. No shortage of success last year. I mean, it's the Caleb Williams effect, maybe the Lincoln Riley effect. But as it stands, I'm Caleb Williams' guy. I think I got him first overall in this year's draft. So let's dive into this, man. Of course, we all know about Lincoln Riley, the infamous returning offensive coordinator, Josh Henson. It's kind of just like Lincoln Riley's assistant at this point on offense. And then they're returning Alex Grinch, right? So let me jump into what I like and what I don't like about USC. Obviously, I love Caleb Williams. That dude is a walking highlight reel, can extend plays. That's the whole reason that USC had the second most efficient offense last year. But the thing that really sticks out about USC is how poor their defense was last year. 107th in defensive efficiency, absolutely terrible. And they return Alex Grinch. So what's really going to change? Alex Grinch didn't really have too much of a modicum of success at OU. I don't think it really changes, especially when we've shown that at USC it doesn't really change either. So I don't know, man. Defense, like you said last year when we were talking USC win totals, why you kept fading them to the moon. Defense. You have to play some defense. And when we talk about how good the rest of this league looks from a win totals perspective, from returning production perspective, defense is going to be the key in this one. But let's go ahead and just look at some important numbers here. There is a new thing coming out this year. We're not just doing returning production, but we have to factor in transfers too. So there's something called transfers and returning production, TARP. Created by Action Network. Shoob and I are pretty big on this statistic, and USC is number 23 in TARP, although really high offensively, but very poor defensive TARP. And what does that mean? That typically means you're going to regress when it comes to the defensive side. Yes, USC did bring in some really good or some really solid transfers, but a bunch of young guys who don't have a lot of statistics to their name. Shoob, I would be remiss if I didn't point out all the weapons that they brought in, though. Offense, man. Dorian Singer from Arizona, huge get for them to replace Jordan Addison. They're gonna be firing all cylinders, just as they were last year. They have a really strong group. They're going to pair him with Mario Williams, Brendan Rice, and then they also brought in a 5-star wide receiver in Zachariah Branch. So there's no shortage of weapons on that side of the ball. And then you have Caleb Williams. Forget about it. Not to mention, USC also had a pretty solid offensive line that last year. A lot of Pac-12 teams had a pretty solid offensive line last year. And their defense, man, I think it can only improve. I know their defensive rating for their TARP returning production is negative, but they were 107th last year, Shoob. 107th. They brought in Mason Cobb from Oklahoma State, top tackler for that team, possibly their best defender. They brought in a bunch of other guys, Bear Alexander from the University of Georgia, Anthony Lucas from Texas A&M, Jack Sullivan from Purdue, Kyron Barrs from Arizona, Traquan Figgins from Bama, Christian Roland Wallace, Arizona. Arizona got gutted by USC in the transfer portal. Let's just say that the whole Arizona team that was worth anything made its way over to USC. So what's the important thing when we consider win totals? The schedule. The schedule is completely paramount to this team. USC starts the season with basically 4 bye weeks. So San Jose State, Nevada, Stanford, and an actual bye week, and the bye week might be a more challenging opponent than the first 3. So they're going to start 3-0. The Arizona schools in Colorado, those are wins. That's 6 wins. And then it gets a little tough. I'll give them a win against Cal. I'll give them 7. But between their games with at Notre Dame, Utah, Washington, at Oregon, and UCLA, I can see them losing about 2 of those. And when our win total's sitting there at 10, I don't think it's likely for them to go over and win 11, given the quality of their schedule this year. And for that reason, I'm going to be on the USC under, but I think they're legitimately a team that could be in the Pac-12 championship and a potential 4 seed in the college football playoff if they win the Pac-12 championship. But 11-1 coming out of the season, I don't know about that, Shoob. How do you feel about it?
Obviously, last year, notoriously for me, I was betting against USC like every single week. And for the same reasons that you said, it was because the defense, it really wasn't that great. They had a lot of turnover luck last year. That is not something that's a repeatable skill. But with that being said,
Unless you're Iowa.
I mean, unless you are Iowa, that's correct. But with that being said, this defense is going to improve, is it not? I mean, just look at the transfer portal list that Lincoln Riley brought in. I think that it's a defense that really can take a step forward this year. Maybe not necessarily into the top 50. Maybe they can jump from, number 107 in FBS to maybe, let's say, number 70 or number 60. That's a pretty big improvement year over year. And if USC does jump into the top 50 in defense, I think that the Trojans are in store for a pretty good year. In fact, I think that's college football playoff upside right there if they can get that defense inside the top 50. But as you mentioned, they did bring in a lot of new starters. It has to be improved by default. We say that a lot. When you are so bad the previous year, you bring in a bunch of new guys, a lot of high-profile transfers. You have to be better by default. They lose Tuli Tuapolotu on the defensive line, which I think is actually a pretty big loss. He went to the draft. He had 13 and a half of USC's 26 and a half total sacks on the year. So he literally had over half of the team's total sacks from last year. So that has to improve. You mentioned the secondary. You mentioned them adding Roland Wallace, losing Mekhi Blackman to the draft as well. So they are losing some production, but they are bringing in a lot. I think it's going to be a net positive. And as far as the offense, man, completely agree with you on everything. I actually really like their running backs. I really liked Austin Jones last year when he came in relief of Travis Dye.
They also got Marshawn Lloyd from South Carolina.
Exactly, and Marshawn Lloyd, who I think should be pretty impactful. He led South Carolina in rushing and total touchdowns last year. He led all skill position players in total touchdowns for the Gamecocks. This offense is going to be loaded. I mean, enough said. You're going to hear a lot of people say it's not rocket science. USC's offense is going to be pretty dang good. It could be the number 1 offense in the country by the end of the year. So with that being said, USC, we have to look at this holistically. They went 11-3 last year. They lost the Pac-12 championship game. They lost the Cotton Bowl to Tulane. They kind of fizzled out there at the end. They were 11-3. They were just on the cusp of the college football playoff, but were they really that good of a team? In my opinion, they weren't that good of a team. That showed itself at the very end of the season. They were 4-1 last year in 1-score games in the regular season. So we move back over to the schedule. So when I look at this schedule, I break it down into 2 halves. The first half of the season, if USC does not start 6-0, I would be absolutely floored. I mean, look at the first 6 on that schedule. Then you get the Notre Dame game. Second half of the schedule, that's where the money's going to be made for Lincoln Riley and the Trojans. You go at Notre Dame, Utah, at Cal, Washington, at Oregon, and then UCLA. That back half of the schedule, I think going 5-1 in that stretch right there would be a win in my book. I think if you go 5-1 in that last stretch of the schedule, it probably means USC's in the Pac-12 championship game and probably is competing for the college football playoff. If they have 2 losses in that stretch, which I think is very well possible, I will say, though, it does help that they have Washington and Utah at home. Notre Dame is not a conference game, granted, but that's still away. And then you got Oregon away late in the year. I see USC finishing at 10-2. I think this team will be better than it was last year, but that doesn't necessarily mean it will have the same record as last year's team did, because I think last year's team was pretty lucky to get where they did. So 10-2, that puts them right on the line at 10. So I'm a push, but I'm going to lean under here for the purposes of the podcast. So I would say USC is a little bit more likely to go 9-3 than they are 11-1. I am under. And then as far as Gonzo, he is not here today, of course, but his pick, he is going under as well on USC. Wow. A 3-way under here on USC. When
We just assure that they're gonna make the playoffs, like be 11-1 or 12-0.
Well, I was about to say, especially for the Pac-12, when we had a group consensus on a team, I think we went 7-0 when we agreed on Pac-12 teams last year in win totals. So we were pretty spot on last year. So we will see. USC, we're not buying the hype this year, but I think Caleb Williams could easily repeat as a Heisman winner. I mean, he's going to be the number 1 pick in the draft. I think we can all agree on that.
I mean, Caleb Williams is the X factor, man. He is the whole heart of the USC team. Without Caleb Williams last year, that USC team is probably 6-6 or 7-5. They're probably barely sniffing bowl eligibility. I mean, that's how impactful Caleb Williams is.
Absolutely, but it all boils down to the defense, man. It's not rocket science. If that defense takes a massive step forward, this team is college football playoff and Pac-12 championship upside without a
Well,
doubt.
speaking of teams who have a lot of upside, but might have been held back by their defense a little bit, let's jump into Oregon, Shoob. What do you got on Oregon on their win total this year?
Absolutely. A lot of these teams, especially at the top half of the Pac-12, are kind of built very similarly. A lot of similar strengths and weaknesses. Oregon comes in with a line at 9.5, so just a shade under the 10.0 for USC. Oregon, the Ducks last year, Dan Lanning, their head coach, the head man there in Eugene. He is in his second season going into this year. Oregon went 10-3 last year, and they kind of had a similar fate to USC last year. They started the season out very well. A lot of people were talking, hey, potentially Pac-12 championship, maybe college football playoff appearance. And they kind of sputtered out there at the end of the season. They lost to Oregon State in the Civil War last year. They went 10-3, narrowly missed out on the Pac-12 championship game. And both of these two teams that we've covered so far, Oregon and USC, they did not win the Pac-12, but they are the leaders at the top this year. The offense for Oregon, they returned 5 starters. Of course, quarterback Bo Nix, he had a breakout season last year, as expected, going into a new system, new team, just new surroundings for him. And believe it or not, I want you to take a quick guess here. How many games of starting experience do you think Bo Nix has under his belt so far in his entire career?
I'm gonna say 40.
47. That man has played as a true freshman all the way through his senior year, and now he's going into a 5th year. So with the COVID rule, Bo Nix, I mean, that man could finish potentially with 60 career starts under his belt as a college player. I mean, that's like uncharted territory thanks to the COVID rule. But you guys get the point. Plenty of experience for Bo Nix. The offense, both of their main running backs return. I think Bucky Irving last year was actually the better running back on the team, and that he should have got more touches than Noah Winnington last year. So look out for Bucky Irving. I like him a lot out of the backfield. Their top 2 pass catchers return. Tight end Ferguson returns as well. More receiver depth they added in the portal. Their offensive line was elite last year. A lot of these Pac-12 teams had very good offensive lines. They were number 3 in average line large last year. 1 starter returns, though, on the offensive line from last year, which is a little bit of a red flag for me. But they did add 2 solid portal additions. So perhaps maybe the drop-off won't be as big as one would normally expect there. And then as far as the defense, I mean, I was very high on this defense last year. I thought the Ducks defense was going to be the strength of that team, and it turned out it really wasn't. The offense was the better half of the two units. The defense was 48th last year in schedule adjusted defensive efficiency. They had 4 players, though, drafted off that defense. So they had talent, but they didn't necessarily perform up to what I expected. And Dan Lanning did bring in a new co-defensive coordinator, Chris Hampton from Tulane, which I think was a good hire. So digging in a little bit further, the defensive line last year was not necessarily the greatest. They were average stuffing the run, below average at getting pressure to the quarterback. Most of those guys return. I think adding edge Jordan Birch from South Carolina should help as well. And then as far as a linebacker room, they had 2 linebackers drafted. And I think they have good secondary depth now. The secondary necessarily wasn't the greatest last year, but they have a lot of upperclassmen returning in the back end. So hopefully for Duck fans, that just having that sheer experience should help Oregon. And then finally, the schedule. When we do these breakdowns at the end of the day, it's going to be all about schedule. That's what ultimately it boils down to when you're thinking of these lines. So looking at Oregon's schedule, they have a non-conference game at Texas Tech in week 2, which I think could be tricky. Do not overlook that game if I'm an Oregon fan. I actually am very high on Texas Tech going into this year. That could be an L if they are not careful. Look out for that. That's going to be a great underrated non-conference matchup just in general this year, FYI. And then as far as the Pac-12 slate, does not help that they have to go at Utah and at Washington. So the home away draws against some of the better teams of the Pac-12. They didn't necessarily get the greatest draw going into this year. However, they are home against USC and Oregon State, which I think helps. So maybe perhaps that balances out a little bit. So when it comes down to this line sitting at 9.5, am I over? Am I under? Well, I think it ultimately boils down to replacing Kenny Dillingham. We didn't really touch on that yet, but I think Kenny Dillingham, losing him at offensive coordinator, that's a big question mark for me. Is the play calling going to be as good and sharp as it was last year? Is Bo Nix going to put up the same level of stats as he did last year without his star offensive coordinator calling plays? And then, obviously, the offensive line probably regresses a little bit. It was very good last year. The defense needs to improve. As I said before, I am going to lean under because there's a little bit too many question marks for me. So I am lean under here, but I obviously would be shocked if Oregon loses more than, let's say, 3 or 4 games.
Yeah, all the things that you said about Oregon are very true, Shoob. I mean, they brought in Will Stein to be OC. He was the offensive coordinator at UTSA last year, which boasted the 31st most efficient offense. So they're not taking too much of a drop off, considering that Will Stein was working with, I guess you could say, lesser talent, but also against, I guess, lesser opponents as well, you could argue. But regardless, they have a guy who is somewhat of a proven commodity coming in. But again, Kenny Dillingham doesn't grow on trees. So we'll see what that looks like moving forward. A lot of great points, Shu, but one thing I really like about Oregon is their TARP rating. They're number 5 in all of college football in returning production, transfers and returning production, which really bodes well for their future. Yes, they did lose some players in the offensive line, but they had some great portal additions. And I don't think that offensive line is going to creep outside of the top 20. I mean, in both sack rate and line yards, they were top 3 last year. That's outstanding. It means by and far they're at least a top 3 offensive line last year. I think they still stay within the top 15, which is more than enough to be effective, especially with the offensive weapons that they have, which you kind of touched on. One transfer I really like on offense is Tez Johnson from Troy. I think that's a very underrated transfer, and he'll be a very impactful player for Bo Nix. Maybe even Bo Nix's number 1 option when it comes down to it. So I'm looking forward to seeing that as well. You kind of touched on the transfers already on defense, although there are a couple that I do want to bring some mentions of. That's Evan Williams from Fresno State, the safety, and linebacker Justin Jacobs from Iowa. I think those are 2 key additions that will help improve their defense, or at least replace some of the guys that they lost to the NFL. And they have a surplus on the defensive line as well. So this team is deep. This team is definitely deep. And I think they can only, at the very least, hold to the status quo of last year of their defensive efficiency rating at 48, which you mentioned. Now, when you talk about the schedule, the all-important thing here, the schedule, I agree. I am totally with you on that Texas Tech game, Shub. This is why I was completely unconfident in my overall pick with this one because I think that Texas Tech game could very well decide this win total. And that game is at Texas Tech. I think Texas Tech could win that game. I really
That's a
do. I
good
think Oregon.
measuring stick for both of
I,
those teams.
I think it is. I think Oregon could catch themselves sleeping. It's an early season game. We see a lot of teams. I mean, we saw what happened with Oregon last year, early season versus UGA. I think if they played later in the season, maybe it's a little bit closer, but ultimately it's not going to change the outcome. But early season games, that's where these upsets happen, man. Teams are not completely ready to play. They don't have an identity yet. So that is definitely a possible upset game. I also have their other possibles as Washington, at Utah, home against USC, and Oregon State. Of those possibles, I think they'll win two, maybe three. I don't think Oregon State gets them 3 years in a row. I think they'll get Oregon State this year. Definite wins for me: Portland State, Hawaii, Colorado, Stanford, Wazoo, Cal, and Arizona State. I think they've got a good shot to go 9-3 or 10-2, but I'm going to lean towards the over here because of all the returning production. They've got Bo Nix, who's got 47 games under his belt, as you mentioned. They should still have a pretty pristine offensive line, and they've only added weapons on both sides of the ball. That's why their transfer and returning production rating is so high. Honestly, that Tech game is the deciding factor. I think I'll know early season if this win total has a shot or not, but I am going over on the Ducks.
I like it. So a little bit of disagreement here between us, but I think we're right in the same ballpark. I think
It's
10
it's
and
not
2, 9 and
confident.
3. Right.
Yeah.
10 and 2, 9 and 3. I think we're both in that range. But worst case scenario, like you mentioned, if they drop that game to Tech and then let's say, they lose to Washington, Utah, Oregon State, USC, if they fall behind all those teams, you could see a worst case scenario here as at like 7 and 5. That's like absolutely worst case scenario for the Ducks. But as we both have said, college football playoff and Pac-12 championship upside. So as far as Gonzo, what is his take on Oregon? 9.5 is the line. He is going under. He is going lean under here, just like me. So we have our first disagreement here between the three of us on the podcast. So moving a little bit up north from Eugene to Seattle, the Washington Huskies, one of the quietest, most successful teams in all of college football last year. They are also sitting at a line of 9.5, like their counterparts down south in Eugene. Washington Huskies, 9.5. Xan, lead us off here.
So first, I just want to preface one thing, and that's their head coach, Kalen DeBoer. Since coming in last year, he took the league by storm immediately. And one thing I really just want to point out about their head coach, Kalen DeBoer, is he is a born winner. We touched about this last year on Pac-12 win totals when we were first covering him as a new incomer. Do you know what his head coaching record is up to this current date?
I do not know that number, but I know it's a pretty good record.
It's 90-11 as a head coach. That's at all levels of football, but that he is a born winner. This man is incredible. They're also returning their offensive coordinator, Ryan Grubb, which also came with him last year, who returns the 5th most efficient offense, or at least had that last year. And then you have William Inge and Chuck Morrell, who are just kind of there as the DCs. They weren't very effective last year, 84th in defensive efficiency, which, go figure, once again with one of these teams, amazing offense and their defense holds them back. That's kind of been the bugaboo for these 3 top teams, and that's ultimately what's holding them back. But Shoob, do you know what I really love about this team? Number two in TARP rating. Transfers and returning production, they are number 2 in the positive column, which means they have an amazing chance to improve this year, and they were already pretty dang good last year, Shoob. So I honestly, the sky's the limit for these guys. Michael Penix returns. We already know. We've seen the revitalization of his career after coming from Indiana. He has turned himself into an amazing player. Not to mention the wide receiver stable that Washington has, man. They have 2 potential first-round picks on offense, man. Romo Dunze. Jalen McMillan, Jalen Polk. They are stacked. They are absolutely stacked on offense. And they're returning the same OC, man. I just don't see how this team regresses on offense. They are still going to be an absolute powerhouse. They were number 5 in offensive efficiency for a reason. And 24th in line yards, 1st in sack rate. They are amazing at protecting their quarterback. I mean, which is why they were so effective in passing the ball last year. So 24th and first, two ratings, very likely a top 15 offensive line by all the metrics. Very good. 84th defensive efficiency. We need to see some return, some improvement there, which they may get. They did get a good portal addition in their cornerback, Jabbar Muhammad from OSU. And they also got a few other guys around the league. One thing I really want to mention that I didn't touch on with the offense is the running back transfers. They also brought in Dylan Johnson from Mississippi State and Daniel Nada from Arizona State. So they've got a whole three-headed monster there, and they already have Cam Davis there on board. So they have no shortage of options on their offense right now to move that ball. My only question is their defense. And based upon the returning production that they have and the transfers that they brought in, I think they can at least get that 84th in defensive efficiency to about 60. 60, if they can get it to 50, they're in business. If they can get it to the top 50, they are in business for the college football playoff. Now, Shoob, they sit there at a win total of 9.5, which with how top heavy this league is, that is a very, very tricky thing, considering that the three teams at the top are all alike with strong offense and relatively weaker defenses. It kind of makes a lot of these games toss-ups. But I'm going to go ahead and say they win Boise. They win against Tulsa. They win at Michigan State. They win against Cal. They win against Arizona. They start 5-0. I'm going to go ahead and say that. Then they get Oregon at home off of a bye week. That's huge. That's huge. I'm going to say they beat Oregon off the bye week at home, time to prep, 6-0. Arizona State and Stanford are next, 8-0, right there, right off the bat. Then they finish at USC, Utah, at Oregon State, and against Wazoo. I think they can at least go 2-2 in that stretch, at the very least, which puts them at 10 wins. So, Shoob, I'm all over the Washington over. Don't bet against Kalen DeBoer. That man is 90-11 for a reason.
I love it. Going over on Washington. Man, I'm pretty high on this team, to be honest. And I know we're recording today is what, June 17th, I believe. It's early in the offseason. It's early in the offseason, but as of right now, if I had to pick a team to win the Pac-12 conference, my pick would be the Washington Huskies. I mean, you already touched on most of it. How many teams out there have starting quarterback, head coach, both coordinators, offensive coordinator and defensive coordinator returning? Not a lot of teams can say that. That's a pretty good recipe for positive improvement year over year. And on top of that, it's not like we're talking about a team that went 8-4 last year and is quietly a dark horse. I mean, it feels like Washington's a dark horse, but this team went 11-2 last year. Xan, why is Washington getting no media coverage? This team went 11-2 last year. They won the Alamo Bowl over Texas. I mean, why is this team slept on so much? I don't get it.
You know, I think it's the Pac-12 in general. USC is the only one that gets the media hype. And then with all the news going on with the Pac-12 potentially dissolving and conference realignment, I think people are just automatically looking past the Pac-12 aside from USC. And I think that's the real issue here. And that's why we're doing this win total to show you guys the Pac-12 is here. The Pac-12 is a legitimate contender this season.
Yeah, I mean, it's on record with me right here, right now. I think the Washington Huskies are the best team in the Pac-12 as of right now. You already touched on everything, man. Michael Penix. He wasn't necessarily an elite quarterback. He wasn't like top 5 according to all the metrics, but he still was one of the better quarterbacks in all of college football. And to be honest, when you have Kalen DeBoer's offense, Michael Penix doesn't necessarily need to be like a Caleb Williams. He just needs to be Michael Penix. He just needs to be what he was last year. And this offense is going to be pretty dang good like they were last year. You already touched on the pass catchers. I mean, that is quite a stable of horses they have there. Top 6 pass catchers return. I also like the offensive line. Both of their starting tackles from last year return, which is very good. The interior of the O-line may be a little bit inexperienced there, but hopefully that won't necessarily be an Achilles heel for them. I don't think it will be. So I think the offensive line will be really good. And as far as the defense, you already touched on it. They return so much production. I think that they should start 3-0 pretty easily in non-con. Boise State at home, Tulsa at home, and then at Michigan State. That Michigan State team is not going to be very good, in my opinion. I would expect to be 3-0 if I'm a Washington fan in the non-conference slate. And then they get a nice little ramp up in the Pac-12 play with Cal and at Arizona. I agree with you. I think a 5-0 start should be expected if you are a Washington fan. And then they got the bye week to prepare for Oregon. That's huge. very huge, and they got that at home. That's going to be a huge swing game in this conference. And then you look at the rest of the schedule. What is a little bit tricky is that back end of the schedule right there, those last 4 games, that stretch where they got to go at USC, then Utah, at Oregon State, then Wazoo. That's going to be tough. I would be surprised if there isn't a loss baked in there somewhere, but I think that this team has the upside to go 11-1. 11-1 and win the Pac-12. I think this team will be in the Pac-12 championship game. They're one of my picks to be in the top 2. I think they can win the Pac-12. I think they have the upside to make the college football playoff. I mean, they have 3 first-round draft picks on their team going into right now, which I think a lot of people maybe don't realize. Michael Penix, he isn't going to be the top quarterback in this draft coming out, but he's going to be one of the top maybe 5 or so quarterbacks. He could be a first-round pick. They also have Braylon Trice on the defensive line at edge rusher, who's projected to be a first-round pick. And then, of course, Roma Dunze, in addition to all the other stud receivers that they have. Dunze is projected to be a first-round pick. I mean, this team has legitimate, like, high-end NFL talent on it. And I feel like just a lot of people maybe just don't realize that. I just feel like they don't realize that. And with all that being said, I would be pretty shocked if this team loses more than 2 or 3 games in the regular season. I think it would take maybe a Penix injury or something like that. I am going over. All I see with this team is upside, 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 building off of what they accomplished last season with Kalen DeBoer. So I'm in agreement. Over.
I'm 100% with you, Shoob. I mean, the only thing that stops them from getting this over are injuries, whether it be offensive line, whether it be Michael Penix. That's the only thing that's going to prevent them from getting this over. I'm with you. I put my personal money on this, actually, on a win total. I put some money down on Washington because I just feel that supremely confident in it. And I can't say the same about Oregon or USC, but Washington is one that I 100% will put my money where my mouth is.
So let's see what Gonzo has to say. Are we in agreement? Are we in unison on the Washington over? We are not. Gonzo is going under on the Huskies. Under at 9.5.
I wonder what he saw. Yeah, I wonder what he saw.
He doesn't have a note, so I assume this is a lean under for him. I think he's a push to lean under. But yeah, me and you are pretty high on the Huskies here. Gonzo is lean under.
I'm with you that the Huskies are the best team in the Pac-12. All right, now let's move on to a team who sustained a lot of success last year that a lot of people didn't really expect them to have. UCLA. Shoob, what's your take on the Bruins this year?
I was one of those people that didn't have high expectations for them last year, and they proved me wrong. I was a hater. So, UCLA, a lot of turnover with this team coming off of last year. They went 9-4 last year. This is Chip Kelly's 6th year as the head coach at UCLA. Can you believe that? He's been there for that long. 6 seasons for Chip Kelly at UCLA. Flying under the radar, I would say a little bit. However, like Oregon and like USC, this UCLA team, they sputtered out. They sputtered out at the end of the year. They lost 3 of their last 4 games. A very disappointing end to what at one time I thought this team was on a direct path to the Pac-12 championship game last year. I thought that they were that good. I thought they were better than USC, but they really sputtered out there at the end. So a disappointing end of the season for the Bruins. They do have a little bit of turnover this year, especially on the offensive side of the ball. This offense last year, top 10 in efficiency. They were 4th in the Pac-12 in terms of offensive efficiency. Of course, the big missing piece here, they lose quarterback Dorian Thompson-Robinson, DTR. Man, it felt like DTR was there forever. In fact, it's kind of weird to talk about UCLA and not think that DTR is the quarterback. But with that being said, we are focused on 2023. They have a little bit of a quarterback battle going on this year, and I'm pretty interested to see how this pans out here. It's a QB battle between 5-star true freshman Dante Moore from the state of Michigan. Very big get there for Chip Kelly and UCLA. Also, Kent State transfer Colin Schlee is in the mix as well. And then potentially Ethan Garbers, who was the backup for UCLA in 21 and 22. So between those 3 guys, it looks like we don't really have an answer as to who's going to be the quarterback. Again, today's recording date is June 18th. So this could change depending on when you listen to this, but today's June 18th. We don't really know who's going to be the starting quarterback, so that's a big unknown. As far as the running back room, they lose Zach Charbonnet, who I thought was very good for them last year. He averaged 7.0 yards per rush, which is pretty dang good. I would say, however, though, they do have good running depth with TJ Harden, who averaged 7.4 yards per rush. Keegan Jones, they brought in transfer Carson Steele from Ball State as well. Chip Kelly did seem to like a lot of these MAC transfers. He seemed to bring in a few guys from the MAC conference. They lose their top 3 reception leaders from last year. However, they do return some experience in the wide receiver room. The O-line was number 2 in line yards last year. That's part of the reason why this running back room looks pretty good on paper, is because they had a very good offensive line that they were running behind last year. 3 starters are gone from this offensive line. 2 of them they lost to the draft. They did bring, however, 2 3-star transfers. I don't know. I feel like this is a net loss for me. I would expect this offensive line to not be as good as it was last year. It was elite last year. And then as far as the defense, like all these other Pac-12 teams, man, great offense, not necessarily great defense. They were 78th last year in defensive efficiency. However, they do return 8 starters, so a lot of guys coming back. They do have a new defensive coordinator, Danton Lynn, that Chip Kelly brought over from the Baltimore Ravens. He was the Ravens safety coach. He does not have any prior defensive coordinator experience, however, so he's not called the plays in his career. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out, but I don't necessarily mind him going out of the box and finding a new play caller, considering that the defense was pretty mediocre last year. And when you talk about mediocrity, the defensive line was atrociously bad. The defensive line was 121st last year in line yards. It was really bad. That needs to improve. Most of those players return. So this could be an instance of, are they just going to be better by default because all the same guys are coming back with more experience? Or are they just going to be pretty bad because it's the same guys who were bad last year that are coming back this year? You know, Liao Tao Latu. I probably butchered his name so badly.
Those Polynesian names, they're a little tough.
Liatu Latu. He's a pretty good player. I like him a lot. The secondary, however, I don't think the secondary has a ton of depth. So if they have some injuries in the secondary, that could be problematic for this defense. Another thing too, I feel like we don't really touch on special teams a lot, but when you have something that stands out like a really good or really bad special teams unit, UCLA special teams was 118th out of 131 FBS teams last year. That needs to get better. Come on, if you want to try to win the Pac-12 or compete for a Pac-12 championship, you got to be good in all 3 phases. And then the schedule, the good old schedule. So their non-conference slate, I should expect them to win those games, all 3 of those games, but I would be a little bit careful. They got Coastal Carolina at home to open up the year. Coastal Carolina is undergoing a lot of turnover on the coaching staff. However, Grayson McCall is still there. So you got to be a little bit careful with that Coastal team with McCall still there at quarterback. Then they go at San Diego State, a potential new Pac-12 member, by the way. UCLA's leaving, but they could be facing their replacement here pretty soon going at San Diego State. You got to be careful with that. I would expect this to be a win, but again, San Diego State, always a very solid G5 team. I expect them to be a solid G5 team again. The schedule is not very favorable when it comes to playing the tougher teams in this Pac-12 conference this year. They play Utah, they play Oregon State, they play USC. All of those games are on the road. They go at Utah, at Oregon State, at USC. They do have Washington State at home, which I think is favorable. And then all the other lower teams like the Colorados, the Arizona States, the Cows, they have all those games at home, which is good. So I think UCLA is good to rack up those wins against the lower competition, especially at home. I really do not trust their ability to win these games on the road at Utah, at Oregon State, at USC. And the big thing for me is we're looking at this win total line of 8.5. I mean, I'm telling you right now, they got to be careful with this non-con slate. I wouldn't be surprised if they slip up and drop one of those games. I mean, they have a new defensive coordinator, play callers, never called plays before. They will have a brand new quarterback. Could it be Dante Moore? If Dante Moore gets thrown into the fire as a true freshman, are we just going to expect him to light up the world in his first few games? I mean, there's a lot of big question marks for me. I think the offensive line is going to take a significant step back. I am fading this team pretty hard, to be honest. And I look at that line at 8.5. I think that UCLA is a pretty close to lock for Shoob standards to go under this win total of 8.5. I think that their ceiling is perhaps 8-4, 9-3. And I think worst case scenario, they have a 6-6 or 7-5 year. I really think that this quarterback room, if they do not have a guy that emerges as the clear-cut guy that can, match DTR's production, I could see that being a big problem. So with that being said, I'm going under for UCLA.
Good point, Shoob. You took a lot of the points right out of my mouth, like especially with the offensive line and transfers. No shortage of losses for them. I mean, they were number 2 in line yards last year, 32 in sack rate for their offensive line. At least at minimum, they were a top 32 unit. But I do expect regression in the same way that you do. I don't expect it to be so significant that they'll fall out of the top 45, say, but I think they'll still be a solid unit. Not nearly as good as last year, but still a good unit altogether. Their net TARP rating is only a positive of 1. So we're thinking this team is going to be at like a baseline what they were last year, maybe perhaps a little bit worse considering the quarterback situation and the inexperience at that spot. So that's one thing that I really look at when I consider this. But I also notice the MAC transfers, man, which you were talking about. Safety Jordan Anderson is a very underrated MAC transfer coming out of Bowling Green, which is going to be a good addition for them. And then they also have wide receiver J. Michael Sturdivant from Cal coming in, who was actually a pretty dang good receiver, but he played for Cal, Shoob. That's why he didn't really do very well, because they weren't a very good football team. So I think he will, assuming the quarterback play is decent, he'll have a pretty good year this year. Now, I actually disagree a little bit. You said the Pac-12 schedule isn't very favorable towards them. I think they actually have a pretty favorable Pac-12 schedule. Now, in terms of their away games, I'm with you. It is not favorable at all. They play some of the tougher teams away, but they avoid 2 of the big dogs altogether. They avoid Washington and Oregon on their Pac-12 schedule, which is incredibly favorable to me. Now, when I look at their schedule, I see wins against Coastal, San Diego State, NC Central, which I'm with you. They could go 2-1. They could go 2-1 in that stretch, but I'm going to go ahead and say that they win all 3. Stanford, Arizona State, Cal. Those are my 6 wins for them that I'm going to just give them. Possibles. At Oregon State, Wazoo, Colorado, I'm going to say is a possible for them, not a win. And then at Arizona, possibles. And then definite losses to Utah and USC. The thing is, Shoob, I'm with you. I just don't see it. I can definitely see them losing to Oregon State. I can definitely see them losing to Wazoo. I can see them losing to Colorado, man.
You think they lose to Colorado?
I have a pretty hot take about Colorado, and I don't think they're going to win the Pac-12 or anything like that, but I think they're going to be better than everyone's giving them credit for. But I really do think that this UCLA team is a 7-5 team, and I'm going to go ahead and roll with the under, man. They need to get their quarterback situation figured out. I personally think it's going to be Colin Schlee just because of the nature of experience, which is very valuable at this level. And then I believe Dante Moore will get the red shirt, and then he'll be the starter next year. That's just going to be my early prediction. And Colin Schlee's no scrub. He's a good player. But regardless, I mean, it's really hard to say. But like you were saying, Shoob, love the running backs. Offensive line should be decent. The offense should still be a very respectable unit. But it still begs the question, man. This team doesn't have so much coming in that they can really deal with the punches of what they lost. That's why their TARP rating is basically neutral. I'm with you, Shoob. Despite a favorable schedule, under on UCLA.
All right. So me and Xan are both under on 8.5 on UCLA. Gonzo is also under on UCLA. So we're in unison on under USC at 10, and we are in unison 3 ways on UCLA under 8.5. So, like we said last year, when we agreed all 3 ways on a team, we were correct with these Pac-12 dogs here. So, with that being said, it is time to move on to Utah. Man, the top half of this Pac-12 conference is pretty good. It's going to be really fun to watch this year. There's going to be a lot of high-profile games. I'm very excited. I'm very happy that this final year with the LA schools rather in town in the conference still, I think it's going to be pretty fun. Utah, like UCLA, comes in with a line at 8.5. Xan, take us away here.
So obviously, Kyle Whittingham, basically fantastic coach. Reminds me of Mike Gundy a lot. Basically, this cut from the same cloth, representing their old schools. And having a lot of success at programs that otherwise would have. I mean, Utah, people forget, was in the Mountain West not too long ago. And look at them. They're one of the most dominant teams in the Pac-12 here in recent memory. And hats off to Kyle Whittingham. They also have their offensive coordinator returning, Andy Ludwig, which sported the 16th, was 16th in offensive efficiency last year. And DC Morgan Scally, who was 24th in defensive efficiency last year. That's top 25 units on both sides of the ball, Shoob. One thing about Utah, and I think this is why they find themselves as the champion last year, is they have consistency on both sides of the ball. Unlike the teams that we recently just covered, those teams were all offense, no defense. Utah is a good mix of both. They are a very dynamic team and very well coached. Love Utah. In addition to that, Shoob, they are +9 in net tarp rate. Returning production for days, and transfers, all kinds of production. They are primed to improve. Their offensive tarp rating is 5.5, which by the metrics is actually considerably good. When we consider Utah and just how well coached they are and all this returning production, I have nothing but high expectations for them. They've got a returning running back in Jaquindon Jackson, who honestly, I think he's a breakout candidate. He had 531 yards last year, 9 touchdowns on just 78 carries. Just 78 carries, 6.8 yards per rush. They were also top 5 in line yards this past season, and 13th in sack rate. They are an absolute stout offensive line. They also return, of course, Cameron Rising, 26 touchdowns, 8 picks. Always a good ratio when you're going 3-1. And then, honestly, they have some notable departures. They lost Dalton Kincaid to the NFL draft. That is a pretty big loss on the offense, considering how dynamic he was. They lost their best left tackle, Braden Daniels, to the NFL, which is definitely going to hurt the offensive line a little bit. And then they lost one of their more dynamic centers who was interchangeable in there, in Paul Maley, to BYU, of all places. The dreaded in-state rival, not a rivalry kind of thing between those fan bases. But they do hang on to their offensive lineman, Jaron Kump, and I love this guy just because he started 7 games at guard, 3 games at left tackle, and 1 game at center. So this dude is just dynamic, can be moved all over the ball, and a very, very good player. Now, some portal ads I really like from the defense. You give one, you take one. They also got Logan Fano, defensive end from BYU. Really good additions, going to bolster them. Linebacker Levani Damuni from Stanford. We'll talk about how Stanford's lost basically everyone. And then defensive back Miles Battle from Ole Miss. Those are pretty impactful transfers who may rotate and provide good depth and may even start for the Utes this year. So I am really high on that defense. And when we just consider how much talent this team has, I mean, they are returning everybody. They don't have any elite pass catchers, but they do mix the ball. Let's just say their offense is really well coached. They have a very good mix of offense. And the loss of Dalton Kincaid is going to hurt them. That's the only bugaboo I have about their offensive production. But I know that they hit the transfer portal and they brought in some production to hopefully fill that void. Let's look at the schedule, Shoob. Let's look at the schedule for Utah. Wins: Weber State, Cal, Arizona State, Arizona, Colorado. 5. I'm giving them 5 for sure wins. For sure. Possibles: Florida, at Baylor, UCLA, Oregon State, USC, Oregon, Washington. They got a tough schedule, Shoob. They got a tough schedule. Florida got them last year. They're at home this year against Florida. From a talent standpoint, when we consider star talent, Florida should still be able to compete with the Utes. I'm going to say the Utes get them this year. A little payback in the air, a lot of returning production. The Utes win this game. At Baylor's not what they were 2 years ago. I'm going to go ahead and say they beat Baylor too. So a very quality non-con, but I think they're going to come out unscathed. Possibly 2-1, but I think they'll come out unscathed. UCLA, I think they beat UCLA, man. I really do. We just talked about how we're kind of low on UCLA, but UCLA can pose some trouble for people just because they do have some talent on their roster. Oregon State, at USC, at Washington. Those 3 are extremely tricky, Shoob. Extremely tricky. They can easily end up losing 1 or 2 of those games. And then they got to play Oregon as well at home. Shoob, I'm taking 2-2 at best in those 4 games. But luckily for Utah, their win total is only 8.5, Shoob. And I think 9 games is definitely possible and on the precipice for the Utes. Give me the over on Utah.
All right. We got an over here on Utah at 8.5. Man, I pretty much reiterate everything that you said about Utah. But ultimately, what it boils down for me is Cam Rising coming back at quarterback. That obviously was huge. Cam Rising, kind of like Bo Nix. He's a guy that's kind of been around. I feel like you know what to expect with him. I don't think he has upside. I don't think he has another level to unlock, but you know what you're getting with Cam Rising, and that's a pretty good college quarterback. And that's what you need to be successful at this level. And he's the type of quarterback that can help you win a third consecutive Pac-12 championship. Yeah, let's just keep in mind here when we're talking about Utah, this is a team that is back-to-back Pac-12 champions. Like at the end of the day, Kyle Whittingham has his guys playing their best at the end of the year. And I mean, it's his 19th full season at Utah. That guy's been there for almost 2 decades now. Phenomenal coach. They were 10-4 last year with a Rose Bowl loss to Penn State. I mean, I think that this team has a chance to be slightly better than it was last year. You highlighted all the departures and everything, but I'm just going to move ahead here to the schedule because this schedule is pretty interesting, isn't it? I mean, that non-con slate right there with opening against Florida and then at Baylor, you go 2-0 after that, you're looking pretty good. I feel like you're going to know pretty quickly what you're getting with this Utah team. The problem is, what are Kyle Whittingham Utah teams very notorious for? At the beginning of the year, they do not start off well. I do not understand why. I do not get it, but Utah always seems to drop the ball and struggle at the beginning of the year in non-conference play. I mean, if you're not careful, you're going to go 0-2 to start the year if you just play like crap. You know, I don't expect that, but I wouldn't be shocked if we come out of here 1-1 based off of historical track record, which really isn't great when you're thinking about win totals off the jump. And then you already mentioned the Pac-12 slate. Yes, this is truly probably the worst draw of all the top Pac-12 teams going at USC, at Washington, at Oregon State, and then you also get Oregon, and UCLA at home. So they literally draw all of the top 5 Pac-12 teams to start the year. So that Kyle Whittingham track record, though, I expect the defense to improve. I think the defense will be better. It was surprisingly a little bit down last year. Kyle Whittingham, man, that guy knows defense. Scally, however you say it. I think it's Scally. There's no way this defense is going to be as bad as it was last year. It's going to be better. That schedule is tough, but they are favored in every single game, according to my numbers that I'm looking at, except when they go to at Washington. I'm going over, baby. I definitely was not expecting this. When I was going through this, I was thinking under, especially with that schedule, but track record, historical precedent, I'm riding that to a slight, very lean on the over here for Utah. I would probably say 9-3 is the most likely outcome at the end of the year. It'll be very tough if they can win a third consecutive Pac-12 championship with how good the conference is at the top and with that schedule that Utah has. I mean, they should be in the college football playoff if they pull that off. I mean, that would be very impressive.
We shall see, Shoob. They have a tough schedule, so they will definitely have a lot of resume building opportunities for the college football playoff. How does Gonzo feel about the Utah Utes this year?
Good question. Gonzo is in agreement. He is going over on the 8.5 for Utah. So we have unison here, over 8.5 on Utah. And he has a little bit of a note here on the Utes. Gonzo says, Utah, a lot of vets coming back on defense, along with suitable options behind Rising at quarterback. That's one thing that we didn't touch on. They do have good depth at quarterback. Rising has gotten into some injury problems throughout his career, especially in the Rose Bowl. He always seems to get hurt in the Rose Bowl. So will Rising be fully 100% to start the year? We shall see. But that's a good point. They do have decent depth at the quarterback position. That's also part of your strategy here when you're evaluating these win totals, is you sometimes kind of have to assume injuries are going to happen. And when a team has good depth, especially at the most important position on the field, that's a good sign for an over. So 3-way over 8.5 on Utah. Are we ready to move on to the Beavs?
We are certainly ready to move on to the Beavs, Shoob. Very underrated team last year, okay? A lot of people don't give the Beavs their credit, but hey, they had their best season in a very, very long time. Shoob, how are you feeling about the Beavs and their win total this year?
So their line is sitting at 8.5 alongside UCLA and Utah. The Beavs, like Washington, very underrated team. They went 10-3 last year. Probably the most underrated 10-3 team in all of college football last year was the Oregon State Beavers. Extremely underrated head coach in Jonathan Smith. 6th season at Oregon State he's coming into this year. I mean, I personally am a little surprised that he hasn't left already. I think that you would think that some of the higher programs would have Jonathan Smith on their radar. So if you're an Oregon State fan, it's a good sign that Jonathan Smith is still the head coach
He's an
for
Oregon
your
State
team.
guy.
He is an Oregon State guy. That's a very good thing. And Oregon State fans should be pretty grateful to have him. So as far as the offense, DJ Uiagalelei. I can't even say it correctly.
DJU, baby.
We just say DJU because we're not even going to try to pronounce those last names. DJU, the transfer from Clemson. I love this. I love this transfer when it happened because for as good as Oregon State was last year, they're great in the lines of scrimmage. They have a very good defense last year. One of the weaker positions on the team for them last year was, believe it or not, quarterback, which is something that we're not used to saying, especially with teams that are successful. It usually means in today's age that they have a good quarterback. I wouldn't necessarily say Oregon State had great quarterbacks last year. They had okay quarterbacks, but now they bring in DJU, former 5-star recruit once upon a time. Better coaching staff, in my opinion, than what he had at Clemson. I don't think that's a hot take. I think there's another level to unlock here, and I expect some positive regression for DJU at Oregon State. In addition, behind him in the quarterback room, they got Ben Goldbrinson to stay as a backup, which I think is good for depth. Goldbrinson had some starting experience last year. Gebbia and Nolan left, but at the end of the day, are those really that big of losses? So they do lose some depth in the quarterback room, but Goldbrinson returns. They return receiving production from last year, most of their receiving production from last year. All of their top running backs return. The O-line returns 4 out of 5 starters from last year. They were top 10 last year in line yards, and they were top 30 in pass protection rates last year. And 4 out of those 5 guys return. That is a very, very good sign. That's a very good sign. I think that this offensive line unit could be top 5 in the country at the end of the year. They were really good in 2021, take a little bit of a step back last year. I think this offensive line will be elite. Overall, they were 38th last year in offensive efficiency. I think there is top 20 upside for this offense. I really think there is. With DJU and the offensive line being elite, I think there's that upside here for that offense to take a big step forward from what it was last year. And as far as the defense was pretty good last year for the Beavers. 10th last year in defensive efficiency. They were first in the Pac-12 in yards per play given up by a very healthy margin. It was a very good defense on a down-to-down basis. The D-line surprisingly didn't get to the quarterback as much as you would think. They were average against the run, so I would expect that to potentially improve. The linebacker room loses Omar Spates to LSU and Kyrie Fisher, but most of the replacements behind them have seen some playing time. So probably a little bit of a step back there, but at least the guys that are replacing them have a little bit of playing experience. The secondary loses a couple starters as well. I think defensive coordinator Trent Bray, I think he's a phenomenal defensive coordinator, but he's going to be tested this year because they did lose some key cogs on the defensive side of the ball. So I expect some regression on the defensive side here. But what balances that out? I expect the offense to improve. So I think it's a net zero, if anything, for Oregon State in terms of the offense and defenses improving and regressing. And then as far as the schedule, their non-conference slate, I expect a 3-0 start. San Diego State could be potentially tricky. San Jose State was a pretty solid Mountain West team last year. They do open up on the road against them. So they do got to be careful. They can't just completely overlook those Mountain West teams, but I do expect them to win those games and come out 3-0 in the non-conference slate. 3 out of the 4 tougher games in Pac-12 play this year, they draw those games at home, which I think is very good, especially when you're evaluating these win totals. They have Washington at home. They have UCLA at home, and they have Utah at home. That helps that they have some of the better teams at home in those games. They do have to play Oregon on the road at the end of the year in the Civil War. I do expect them to beat the teams that they should beat. I expect them to beat the Cals, the Arizonas, the Colorados of the world, even though most of those games against the lesser teams in the Pac-12 are on the road. I expect Oregon State to win those games. They are favored in 10 out of their 12 games as of right now. The line is 8.5. Give me an over on the Oregon State Beavers at 8.5.
You know what's funny, Shoob, is how you said the additions on offense and the losses on defense should be a net zero. Guess what their net tarp rating is? It's zero. It is legitimately a net zero.
Sounds about
That's,
right.
so that's pretty interesting. And so, like you pointed out, I'm with you on that respect. They were 38th in offensive efficiency last year with horrendous quarterback play. The quarterback play can only get better with DJU at QB, considering that they're also bringing back good offensive line starters. And not to mention, man, they have a really good, bright young running back in Damian Martinez, who rushed for 982 yards and 7 touchdowns last year, averaging over 6 yards a carry. He's a very solid player, and I would look out for him. Also, shout out to Jim McCalzick, offensive line coach for Oregon State the last few years. Man, he deserves a raise because it's not like Oregon State's over here bringing in, 5-star recruits or anything for their offensive line. They're clearly developing the talent that they have there. So I'm surprised this man hasn't been poached off the staff yet, but that's just a whole tangent for another day. Shout out. That is one of the best offensive line coaches in the country. And as you mentioned, Shoob, 4 or 5 starting offensive linemen returning. Love it. Love it. Only expect Oregon State to improve on offense. 38th in offensive efficiency, I think, can easily be in the top 30 at a minimal. But their defensive efficiency, which was 10th last year, considering their net tarp rating for defense was -5, it's going to be a little bit tough to replace that, but I think they'll still stay in the top 30 on that. So I think we're going to have one of those teams that's kind of hovering around the late 20s in defensive and offensive efficiency. But that's consistency on both sides, and that usually spells for good football. When you really look at it, they did bring in a good defensive end. Oluwuse Omotosho from Wyoming, quality player. One thing about Wyoming, solid tangent, they produce a lot of great portal players. So they're clearly doing something right over there. And then they also brought in an offensive tackle, Grant Stark from Nevada, who they hope can help fill one of those voids. But on the flip side, they did lose one of their best linebackers to LSU in Omar Spates. That's certainly a loss for their defense. But nonetheless, man, this is a very well-coached Oregon State Beavers team. They will find a way through the adversity. I mean, Jonathan Smith has a proven track record, and he has done amazing things with this program. And as for the schedule, Shoob, 8.5 wins. I got wins for San Jose State, UC Davis, San Diego State, Wazoo, Cal, Arizona, Colorado, Stanford. Shoob, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 wins. That is counted right there. Possibles, Utah, UCLA, Washington, and at Oregon. 3 of those 4 tough games are at home. I think Oregon's going to beat them this year. I don't think they get them 3 years in a row. I'll probably lose to Washington, but all they have to do is win 1 of those 4 games to hit this over. Give me Oregon State at 9-3. Give me the Oregon State Beavers over.
I love it. We are in unison once again. Gonzo, 3-way unity here on the win totals lines. Let's see. He is also over. 3-way unity on the Oregon State Beavers over, just like last year. Build that dam.
Build that dam. Build that dam.
Absolutely. So thank you guys for watching. That'll conclude part 1 of the Pac-12 win totals. If you want to listen to part 2, go ahead and check out that podcast or check out that video if you're watching on YouTube. That'll be out later in the week if you're watching this early in the second week or the third week of June, I should say. So with that being said, thank you guys for watching. Let us know in the comments what you guys think. We really like it when you guys comment. We love to hear the comments, whether they're good or bad. We would prefer if they would be good and respectful, but if you want to be mean and say that we don't know anything and we're idiots, then go ahead and say that.
At least let us know why.
At least let us know why. Just, we love the comments. We love hearing them. Like this video if you enjoyed this content. And if you're listening on the pod, go ahead and give us a good review and rating. We appreciate it. So with that being said, Pac-12 win totals part 1. Let's end the day. See y'all later. Have a good one.
Peace.